Well, good evening or good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first lecture in a series of Hyde lectures entitled Our Work, Your Work. We have arranged a series of lectures that focus on the relationship between what we do as architects and the consequences of our actions upon others. Sometimes we get referred to as knowledge workers or the creative class. Our work is the production of information, of drawings, of models, spreadsheets, schedules, not schedules, production of information, all truncated by the moment, say that when a set of CDs are completed or an agreed number of site visits have been attended, that is the threshold of our responsibility. But Matthew Crawford has argued that the creative class is in itself in danger of commodification as a necessarily tiresome form of labor in itself, and that knowledge workers are the reincarnation of factory workers. And Peggy Deamer refers to this as the creative class meeting Taylorization. It's okay, I hope. Or somehow the advent of digital design frees us from the historical contradictions of material production, the material production of a building. That is, of labor, of hard graft, of sleeplessness, alienation, injury, and so on and so forth. That we loosely talk about craft and its psychic wellness while we watch the CNC router spin out a model, or that we watch the printer print out some sort of romanticization of the idea of the palimpsest of a drawing that happens in an instant. And that romanticization indemnifies us from the consequences of what we do and the consequences upon the people who build our buildings and are affected by them. So my role as the chair of the Outreach and Engagement Committee is to put forward themes for the lecture with my colleagues, and our lecture series reflects the contributions from other members of the College of Architecture. And we're also indebted to the Hyde Lecture Fund as well for enabling these events. So we are delighted to have Peggy Deamer here to initiate this lecture series. She's one of the most poignant commentators on the issue of work and architecture. Somewhere argued, maybe it was her own description, as anti-post-critical theorist. Is that fair? That wasn't her. Okay, all right. Okay, we're going to accept that. We've got away with it. All right. But here's what she's written, here's what you need to say, and I wrote that down in terms of the introduction. So that bit I wasn't supposed to say. But Peggy Deamer is the Professor Emeritus at Yale University School of Architecture and principal in the firm Deamer Studio. She's the founding member, the research coordinator of the Architecture Lobby, a group advocating for the value of architectural design and labor. She's the editor of Architecture and Capitalism, 1845 to the present, The Architect as Worker, the Imminent Labor of the Creative Class, and the Politics of Design, and the forthcoming Architecture and Labor. Articles by her have appeared in Log, the Avery Review, eFlux, the Harvard Design Magazine, amongst many other journals. Her theory work explores the relationship between subjectivity, design, and labor in the current economy. Her design work has appeared in Home and Garden, that's separate. It's appeared in Home and Garden, Progressive Architecture, the New York Times, amongst other journals. And she's received the Architectural Record 2018 Women in Architecture Activist Award. And I am delighted to welcome Peggy Deamer to Nebraska. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very gracious introduction. And Jason, thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. I'm really happy to be in Nebraska. I've never been here, so for me this is all an education, and it's definitely my pleasure to be here. And I have to say I'm totally thrilled at the theme of the lecture series. And I see I got it wrong. I thought it was our work, we work, but it's our work, your work, but it's all our work. So just the fact that there's a lecture series that has developed that theme, I think is a credit to the institution. So I'm totally delighted to be the first person speaking in the Hyde lecture series. Let me just get to it. There are two parts to my talk. One is the architect as worker, and the other is the worker as activist. Two different things. And I'll just go straight to the first one, which is the architect as worker. And for this, there are 4 main themes that I'm going to go through. I'm hoping not to belabor them. Each of them has 3 sub-themes, and so you'll get it that there are kind of 12 points that I'm going to want to hit with this. And I, again, hope that I don't try your patience with this kind of list approach to things that you might want to talk about. But those 4 things are, we do work, not just art. We are knowledge workers, not just object producers. We are aligned with other types of workers, and we must reflect the society that we work for. So for the first one, we do work, not just art. The first sub-theme is identifying our work as work does not mean that it is not fun, creative, or rewarding. And this is basically just to say I'm trying to shift your idea about work as inherently equal to labor, and labor itself is not a dirty word, but that work is something that, if it's organized correctly, which is basically if you own the means of production, can itself be creative. It does not need to be that you have a creative discipline, art, architecture, graphic design, for it to be creative and fulfilling. Work itself, in an organized, well-fashioned way, when you collaborate and you feel empowered, is inherently creative. What you're seeing here is an image of the Shaker Society. You maybe know the work of the Shakers. It was a celibate society, but I show it because as a utopian society, it stands on one side of 2 ideas of work in utopian societies. One is cut the workday short so that you get to leisure and pleasure. And the other is make sure that your work is fun so that you don't need to cut it short. It is creative. And I'm very much of that second school, as is the Shaker Society. And so if you know the work of the Shakers, the kind of beauty that and integrity that they bring to their functional objects, the way they shared work, the way they were given responsibility for their work, made them creative and love the work because of its inherent honesty, I would say. So the corollary of this then, which is the second subcategory, which is creativity is still work, and artists recognize this more than architects. And I say this because sometimes when I talk to architects and say, we're workers, we go to the office, we get a paycheck. It's like, oh, no, we don't do work, we do art. And so then I find it interesting that artists who really do art themselves recognize that they do work. And I think maybe because of the rhetoric of the starving artist, they're much more conscious about what the value of their work is, what the value of their labor is. And so on the one hand, we're seeing I could show a number of images of artists trying to unionize, but I'm also showing an image of one of the artists who represents a group of contemporary artists more and more who not only argue for the value of their work, but make their art projects be about work, trying to really bring the idea of work to the attention of their public. So this is Casual Friday. So just to say, there's a consciousness amongst artists that I think is missing amongst architects. And then C, the third subcategory here, we are part of the economy, and until we understand this and embrace it, we will not be in a position of power. part of this is just to say that if we think that we're exceptional and don't really have to worry about our place in the economy and our value, we shouldn't be surprised that other people don't think we have a place in the economy and don't have value. So there's a reason to think about those two things together. But also, if we don't actually have a sense about what our position is in the economy, we're simply not going to, again, be in any position of power. At another scale, the corollary of this is that offices that don't understand the value of labor, of their staff labor, don't have a business plan. And if you don't have a business plan, you're definitely not going to be at the seat of power. So moving on to the second main category, we are knowledge workers, not just object producers. And the first subcategory here, we do material work. The buildings we produce are the tip of the iceberg. So part of this is to say that, and I talked about this a bit at the Lunch and Learn, that the more we focus on for ourselves and for our clients this object, this beautiful building, the more we hide the fact that behind that is so much expertise, so much knowledge, so much that we're taught in school, that we experience in the planning boards and the community boards and the zoning and the material experts and the ecological implications. There's so much that is hidden when we only emphasize the object. So this also then comes with a larger definition of design, one that I think is important, which is to say design isn't the design of the object, but it is a problem-defining, problem-solving, information-structuring activity that on the basis of understood goals, conditions, and rules defines a specific course of action. So you're designing the strategy in which the object actually operates, but you're not just designing the object. A second corollary, producing only buildings is piecework, which is the worst form of labor. We have a quote here from Marx, but the essence of this is that if you think that you're going to get a leg up on a difficult economic situation by just producing or picking more, faster, and then getting some extra profit and extra cash, the market adjusts very quickly in order to make that no longer be something that goes into your pocket, but goes into their pocket. It is the most easily manipulated form of exploitation of labor. And I'm hoping that I don't need to explain what piecework is. Again, the more of them you have, the more money you get. You might think of buildings as not pieces, they're just big pieces. So another way of thinking about this is a business plan that hires up and fires down when you have a project. That's piecework. That's just migrant labor. And that is not a business plan. So the third corollary here, we need to leverage our long-term knowledge of and care for the environment. I think in some way this is part and parcel with the first corollary, which is the building is just the tip of the iceberg, and what is below the tip are the long-term knowledge and care for the environment. What we're seeing here are just two examples of different apps that Karen Timberlake have developed. One, Tally, which allows you to calculate the carbon footprint of the materials that you're thinking of using while you're designing. So you're not all the way far upstream before you begin to think about those things. And then an app that actually calculates how the performance of the building is actually working vis-a-vis what the intended effect is. So these are just to say, if spatially we're trying to move beyond the object to think about the system, temporally we're also trying to think about a much longer sense of responsibility. So third major point here, we are aligned with other types of workers. For a subcategory, we are part of a large team of knowledge producers, contractors, engineers, owners, financial analysts, lawyers, blah, blah, blah. You can read this. But just to say, this is my all-time favorite photograph, which is everybody who worked in Federation Square in Melbourne, Australia, everybody. And that, to me, is such an inspiring image that everybody there is claiming their pride in making what really is a fabulous space, Federation Square, if you've ever been there. And so to me, this is kind of a model of thinking about the team and caring for each other and respecting each other's knowledge in the full process. B, the worker-manager distinction is important, but no longer the primary operative labor dialectic. Who does and does not control money is. I say this partly because when we talk about work, when we talk about labor, I think one of the first things you think about is the relationships that you might have in your offices. Those of you who are firm owners, think about it in relationship to staff, but many of you who are workers, think about what your relationship is like with the partners and the firm owners, and you don't want that to be antagonistic, and there's something about the labor management distinction which comes up with unionization, which is has implicit a tension between those two things. That division between staff and owners is important. We can't pretend it's not there. And Zizek would actually say the best thing that a owner or manager can do is not deceive you into thinking that you're all best friends and you're all just a team. So there is something to that, so that you're not afraid to ask for things and disrupt what seems like a friendship. But on the other hand, if I'm saying that that's important, I also want to recognize how difficult it is in architecture because we do want to work as a team. We do want it to be friendly. As you move up in a firm, you become a manager of a team. You're now actually an owner. And so what it means to be, that division is very, very fuzzy. So I'm completely sympathetic for how screwy this kind of consciousness is within our discipline. But the real point is that you can spend a lot of time thinking about those things, but the reality is that firm owners are workers too. And what we really, really need to be thinking about is how architecture, whether you're a firm owner or staff person, can actually begin to think about claiming part of the economic largesse and redirect it in a more social way than the 1% currently is doing. It's a larger political act. And then C, we are aligned with other types of workers. This is a socio-political position. Workers of the world unite. Just to say, if we don't have worker consciousness of ourselves, we don't identify as workers, we're certainly not going to be concerned about other workers and their abuse. And I'm showing the construction workers here at Abu Dhabi, who I think you probably all know, are really indentured servitude, and it's up to us to actually think about that larger sense of worker identity. So the last fourth major category here, you must reflect the society we work for. Subcategory, we aren't exceptional geniuses, no star architects. I don't think I need to belabor this point. We talked about it at the Lunch and Learn. This is just a letter that I wrote to the New York Times when the New York Times wrote an article about the Calatrava Transportation Center in New York that was part of the 9/11 rehabilitation, and it was like 10 times over budget, 10 years late. It was a very critical, very factual article, and a lot of the architects came to the defense, like, if we don't have geniuses like this, if we don't have works of art like this, we don't have the Louvre, we don't have the pyramid, blah, blah, blah. And my feeling, and this is what the letter was about, is like, that's not the argument to have. That's not how you defend architecture. What you defend architecture by saying that notion of genius is outmoded. It never was the case, it isn't the case. It doesn't help our image within society to hold ourselves above as geniuses that are exceptional in some way. We do a lot of sincere social, intellectual work. Subcategory, gender equality is essential, and it's not enough. I just grabbed this from a website it was Case no longer exists. I just thought it was an interesting website, the way they kind of showed things fairly democratically. But we will also notice that there are not many people of color. They're not all that bad on gender. They're not all that great in gender. But we need to be worrying about this. And it's definitely the case that if we don't have people in the profession who reflect the society that we want to do work for, we're guessing at what they want. And that's a problem. And then lastly, we can't give our clients a better world if we don't model, experience, and practice it ourselves. This is from Snøhetta's website, and it doesn't say anything particular except that I love that it doesn't say its name, and it certainly doesn't say anything about the partners. But the point for me is if we think that we are delivering projects to the world that are make a positive social, not just aesthetic, but social contribution, how can we recognize what that ethics is or what that better thing if our daily lives is working in a place that's sexist, racist, discriminating, disempowering, no work-life balance, no money. If that's our day-to-day life, how are we expected to actually give something better to society? I think a lot about that one. Okay, so now I'll go on to part 2, the worker as activist, and I'm going to be talking about the work of the architecture lobby here, which I'm somewhat self-conscious about, because it's not that I want to be advertising the lobby, but for me, it's just the most concrete example I know of activism. So I hope you just take this in the spirit of this is one way that one group of people are being activists, then you might think about other ways as well. But anyway, the Architecture Lobby is an organization of architectural workers advocating for the value of architecture in the general public and for architectural work within the discipline, and these are our demands. This is our manifesto. I'm not going to go through all this. It will take up time. You can go to the website and you can read all this, but in some way it's all versions of what I've been trying to say in part 1 of the lecture series. This is just briefly a diagram of how we organize ourselves, which is to say that there are chapters in different cities and different areas. They all have a chapter steward, which is what the S is around there. They relate to each other around similar projects. But all of them also relate to the organizing committee, and the organizing committee makes sure that everyone knows about what everybody else is doing, and that organizing committee has certain people on it. Like I'm the research coordinator is one of those people. So it's fairly rhizomatic, but it also attempts to be kind of organized for the sake of communication. So this part of the talk has 3 parts to it. The first has to do with the theory work that we do, and I identify that theory work as doing our institutional critique. The second part has to do with performance, which has to do with what I call ideological critique. And then the third has to do with the practice, which is kind of more concrete things that we do to change the discipline, and those are our actions. So then for theory, I'll go through kind of 3 different projects that that we've worked on. And here the line between Lobby's research and my research kind of gets blurry because I got grants to work on some of this, and I was the lead in many of these, but it still is the work that the lobby supports. But the first has to do with architecture and antitrust laws. Which might sound incredibly dry, but I got to this because a fellow lobby member and I had a meeting with Robert Ivey, who is the CEO of the AIA. He was very kind to meet with us. He met with us with their attorney. I think they were humoring us, but we met with them to say, why isn't the AIA worried about just at the most fundamental level, illegal labor practices, unpaid internships, no overtime, not to mention the fact that we are an underpaid fees. And so bad wages by bad fees. Why doesn't the AIA talk about this? And the very quick response was because of antitrust laws. And it is the case that the Justice Department has issued 2 consent decrees on the AIA when they saw that the AIA, in even discussing fee schedules, were breaking the law, and that we were colluding. And so, and those 2 consent decrees are very draconian. And you know, I forget what AIA had to pay, but for 10 years after the second one, every single AIA meeting, whether it was national, regional, or local, had to start the meeting with a 10-minute video that said what collusion was, which is why we couldn't talk about fees and we can't talk about wages. And it is just the case, and it's not just the AIA that will get in trouble if we talk about it. The rule is such that if I have a conversation with you and I say something like, I'm not going to go after this competition because I know that they actually in the end aren't going to pay. So I won't do the competition if you don't do the competition. 10 years in jail, $10,000. So it is draconian. So in some way it made me sympathetic for what the AIA can and cannot do. And so we all kind of need to know that that's part of the framework. But in my research, there were still other observations that I'll go through, but one is, and maybe everybody knows this, and I didn't know it, that antitrust laws have nothing other than making sure that we compete. Beginning and end of story, gotta compete. Has nothing to do with anything else. If we want to do something that says, but isn't there some kind of other competition that is for benefit of society, that's all legislation. This is all about competing. So, this is, so one of the observations in this is decreased exemption of professions from business model competition in the face of changing capitalism, which is to say the antitrust laws change with the economy, and it is the case that in the 70s, and we all know what the 70s means, which is, you know, the advent of Reaganomics and Margaret Thatcher and neoliberalism, the professions used to be exempt from antitrust laws, and they no longer were after that. All of a sudden they said, this is like, wow, you know, fee schedules is like, not at all. And what had preserved the fee schedules was the Code of Ethics. And so in some way, when the Justice Department came after the professions around fee schedules, basically they attacked the ethics, and that's when the AIA gave up a Code of Ethics. So there's a direct relationship between ethics and how our economy wants us to work. But also part of what I learned in this is that within the professions, architecture is particularly vulnerable. We have, I think we have 1/10 the number of architects as there are lawyers or doctors, but that basically means that we are disempowered when it comes to lobbying or changing legislation around these things. So professions in general were hit, but architecture in particular. So in this research, again, you know, how can we actually bypass antitrust laws? This became a real interest of ours. Third-party surveys, legislation, unions, and cooperatives. Third-party surveys, I think I mentioned this at the Lunch and Learn. It can be the case that if a neutral institution like a university begins to describe the conditions in a profession, begins to describe what people are paying or getting paid, that's not seen as collusion, that's just seen as description, and then you all can behave in a certain way after that. Legislation, again, if you feel that the competition is not helping society, you can go to your legislator and ask them to make a bill such that mitigating competition for larger social gain happens. That means going to your state legislator, your national legislator. You can imagine how many of those legislators care about the issues that we have because they're not going to worry about losing votes for avoiding a certain way. Unions are exempt from antitrust laws, just to say, and so are cooperatives. So we can talk more about that. Okay, second institutional critique, which came from a paper that we wrote in the lobby called A Response to AIA Values. This was after, I think you maybe all know about this, but Robert Ivey, after Trump was elected, wrote a piece to all the members of the AIA saying, congratulations, we're with you. Any projects, we support you. Great. And the members were not all that happy. So then they wrote an apology, and that apology was their AIA values. And so we wrote a response to those values, which was kind of an interrogation of what those values were. And so this is kind of what we came up with. It's kind of where the AIA is stuck. Avoidance of conditions that affect employees. And just to say, I don't think you're going to see the word employee anywhere in the AIA. We're all emerging practitioners. You know, again, this is part of what I was saying about Zizek. It's like, let's just mask the fact that there's a difference, that someone's handing you a check and someone is receiving a check. So that's part of the problem. Avoidance of issues that are ethically or politically difficult when the goal is securing work from the government and developers at all costs. Again, they see their role as getting work at all costs, and so you don't want to say anything controversial that might offend either the government or the developers. A tilting to large firms that deliver the most members. It's usually as large firms pay for their staff to be members, and so they cater to the issues with large firms as opposed to small firms. Avoidance of addressing conditions that shape the profession in the 21st century, which I would say is primarily technology. How are we actually facing automation? And what does that mean for our profession? And the changing economy, which is to say an economy that is no longer even manufacturing-based or even service-based, but is kind of gig-based. And that we're not in any way adjusting the profession to those new realities. And I would say extending the race to the bottom with competition for lower and lower fees beyond the competition imposed by antitrust laws. And my example of that is, I think it was at the 2016 National AIA Convention, two of the keynote speakers that were put in front of everybody were firm owners who could prove that they were giving their clients more for charging less. So the model was compete harder, compete better, as opposed to arguing for your value and asking for your fair share, which I think is problematic. And so possible responses here, a professional organization that addresses the precarity of the profession and its role in the public or political sphere. You know, if the AIA wants to do these things and not touch the more difficult issue, let's have another one that actually will talk about those issues, or replace the AIA with but a different kind of organization. Deprofessionalization, which is something I will talk a little bit about, but which is not to see ourselves as a profession, but actually monitor our expertise by certification and not by professionalization. The difference being that certification is monitored by the discipline itself, whereas licensure is monitored by the state. And the idea is that the institution could actually monitor what is considered expertise, perhaps more fluidly and more sympathetically than the state. Or the other is graded professional licenses, which we did also talk about at the Lunch and Learn, which is that they're different degrees of your professional expertise, and you can build certain kind of projects if you've done one kind of experience or another. So these are just ways of being slightly more sympathetic and on the ground reactive. And then the third institutional critique, which is around professionalism, this is what I was saying. This is really kind of looking at sociologists who are kind of trying to understand what it means to be a professional. And in some way, a professional means nothing more, nothing less than the state gives you a license to do things. And so hairdressers are professionals, body workers are professionals. They're all licensed things, and so there is really, in some way, what we think of as a profession is fairly watered down. But still, the idea of the kind of knowledge professional, the kind of professional that requires a lot of education. That's part of what the sociologists are looking at. And one of the things that one learns about this, and Magali Sephardi Larson is particularly articulate about this, is that professionalism responded to a particular 19th century condition when an elite society actually needed to identify itself differently from the rest of society. And it was part of a division of labor that was just coming to the fore. But it very much rests around a certain sense of noblesse oblige. And the point is that it had a certain function in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, but maybe that idea of professionalism no longer serves either a social or an economic purpose. That is her main argument, but the other arguments that Abbott and others say is that really with new technology, that the idea of the professional as distinct from a technician who works with that technology is just disappearing. So if that's professionalism in general, then talking about architecture in particular, I don't know if you all know this book by Robert Gutman. He's a sociologist who worked mostly in architecture, but these are 6 points that he makes about what makes architecture unlike other professions, and it's fairly interesting. And I think most of these you might know, and I hope you're kind of reading this. I think 4 is interesting. Doctors and lawyers order those who execute their work, which is to say nurses and paralegals, around, but we can't order the builder around. Our decisions and roles are regulated. And I also think 6 is interesting. Architectural offices, from partners to architectural employees, order production according to the principle of hierarchy, indeed hierarchies that are often illogical. In architectural firms, people with equivalent training and credentials frequently take their work orders from fellow professionals whose training is no different, so it's weird. But number 5 is what I want to concentrate on just quickly. The demand of architectural services is a function of the market demand for buildings, and architects have not freed themselves from the dependence upon the construction industry, which is, goes up and down, it's part of our precarity. And so my feeling is that there are 2 ways to respond to that, and one is to disengage more, and that's what he's advising. Don't we have another kind of business model that isn't so dependent on the construction industry? And again, I'm looking at these apps that Karen Timberlake developed because they've developed a business model where they sell their apps. They're coming up with a kind of research program that allows them to have a not client-driven source of income. But I'm also more interested in the one that connects more with the industry, and this is just an example of a traditional contract that I think you all know versus the new kinds of contract that I think is much more interesting. What we're seeing over here on the left, which is the standard design bid build, the owner has a contract with the architect, the owner has a contract with the contractor, the architect will get their own consultants, the contractor will get their old subs, there's no relationship between the architect and the contractor, there's no relationship between the architect and the subcontractor, and that's all part of what sets up inherently antagonistic relationship between all those players. Versus integrated project delivery. And I know this sounds really technical, but it is actually conceptually very interesting, and it actually comes out of a whole other theory of contracts than the normal one, which is, we could say, a kind of contract that is the carrot and not the stick. And that carrot is that the owner, in consultation with the architect and the contractor and the other important people at the table, will put a certain amount of money aside after everyone has agreed to what they all want to get out of the project, financially, spiritually, ethically, whatever. And when the building comes in on time and on budget, they all share the profit together. So everyone has an incentive to work together, to be upfront, to be honest, to agree on what really matters. And so you really work as a team and you share the profits. So anyways, that's for ideological critique and theory. Institutional critique now, just I'll go through quickly. Ideological critique, performance. These are performance protests. This is the lobby at the Venice Biennale, 2014. We're reading our manifesto and handing out a book that we published called San Precario, which actually works according to this model of the kind of standard white-collar worker praying about their precarious position, and various architects then contributing their own prayers and their own images. 2 years later, 2016, Venice Biennale, again performing. In this case, we were reading from another book that we produced, which was called Asymmetric Labors, The Economy of Architecture in Theory and in Practice. And we handed out that book. This is a book that basically is about the value of academic labor, asking different academics to talk about how they understand their value, whether that's monetary or respect education-wise. 2018, again, we were there, and this time it wasn't a protest. We were actually invited to do a workshop. And in this one, which was called Dimensions of Citizenship, we passed out the book that we produced on Not Our Wall, which is work that we did investigating not just the RFP for engineers and architects to do prototypes for the southern border wall, but we went down and visited the wall and saw the prototypes and did the calculus around the materials and the legal implications of those. So then the idea was, when we first went to Venice to do the protest, it's kind of like, how can we go to Venice and do a protest where a certain kind of audience, we had a certain kind of captive audience, which is to say the more artistic, high culture people. How could we do a protest there without going to the AIA and doing protests there? And so 2014, we went to the Chicago National Convention and again, read from our manifesto. We were almost arrested, which was kind of fun. And then 2016, same thing in Philadelphia. We also were at 2017, but I don't have images from that. 2018, this last one, the National Convention in New York City, again, trying to get AIA members' attention around that. And then practice, which is the last bit, and you've been very patient. These are just a number of the different practical things we're doing. One is the pledge that we have to give to graduates who are about to go out to the workforce, saying that they won't work for a firm that doesn't pay legal overtime or has unpaid internships, even if they themselves are not part of that abuse. And then another one for the firms, that they too won't participate in that. It's a horrible image, but we've done a number of workshops with professional practice. People who teach professional practice, basically asking the question whether the people who teach that are teaching to the profession that we have or teaching to the profession that we should have. And that has yielded very interesting discussions. And I think I was mentioning to some of you after the lunch and learn that there really are a lot of people that just teach to the practice that we have, and this is how you get work, and this is what you need to know, and blah, blah, blah. But there are many who really recognize that they're educating architects to do something else. And of those, there are two different schools of thought. And one is like, they're not going to work in architecture. I hope they don't work in architecture. We're going to teach you to be a web designer. We're going to teach you to do set design. We're going to teach you anything. But the professional practice is teaching you larger organizational and design skills. The other is absolutely, we're going to stay in the profession. We need to change that profession. So it's interesting discussion. Think-ins, we've had a number of think-ins. Think-ins are really where we get a laborer, a firm or owner, a media person, and somebody from either the AIA or from NCARB to sit at a table to think together about how we can change things for a better discipline. And the idea is that as long as those different people stay in silos, that we won't have the discussion that we need to have. And it's not a teach-in, because we're not teaching anybody. We're just trying to get the right issues on the table. The Pocket Guide to Labor Law. We have a pocket Guide to Labor Law you can download from our website, just so that you know what your rights are as a worker. Again, we produced the book, but what inspired that book for Not Our Wall was a walkout on the day that the RFPs for being recognized as an architecture firm or an engineering firm to be recognized as one of the bidders. Have a walkout that day, whether your firm was involved in putting in an RFP or not. The idea was a time to reflect on why all people had entered the profession, just to think through why it is you were doing what you wanted to do, and think about where you wanted your work and your time to go. So that walkout was quite successful. We have a campaign called Just Design, and the idea here is that we want to give certification to firms that have good labor practices. This would be like LEED, and so those of you who are going out into the workforce will know whether the firm that you're going to work for has more than just beautiful design work, but has good practices. And we identify those good practices under 6 different categories: family-friendly, fair pay, legal labor practices, gender and ethnic diversity, transparency, and agency. All of those being an important part of what makes it a satisfying and empowering place to work. And then the last 2 that we're working on now, these are national campaigns. Small firms, how we set them up to work cooperatively. Legally, cooperatives are actually very hard to set up, and you might imagine why. If antitrust laws are telling us to compete, cooperatives go against that kind of competition, but there is a legal way to cooperativize. But there is also within other business models ways for small firms to share expertise, share work, share materials, share workers, so that when work comes and goes, there are places where you can support each other by lending workers out or inviting workers in. So there's a strong campaign about how to organize that. And then unionization for large firms. And unionization, again, I think most people understand unionization as something that will set up a real tension between employees and employers. But the idea is more to allow the employees to have clear, consistent goals so that the employers can have clear, consistent responses. The idea is that it works for everybody to make that clarity operative and transparent. Collective bargaining is the beginning of actually having a stronger voice, not just for the employees, but for the profession in general. So anyway, that's it. Thank you.
Peggy, I hope you're willing to take questions. So if anybody has a question, I have the microphone, but I'll bring it to you so you can ask a question. All right. You had to be right at the back.
You mentioned earlier that we must reflect the society that we work for, but when you mentioned that, it was more as like us as a group of architects to represent diversity properly. What could we do as like an individual to reflect the society around us?
That's a good question, because it's true that I really was just making sure that we have a full array within the discipline or within a firm. I think it's a really good question. I mean, I think one is just here in school, I think we learn certain lessons that have to do with what looks like a star student or a star colleague that maybe leaves behind people who approach their studio work differently or think about different things. or don't look the part, or don't act the part, acting the part being doing all-nighters and all those different things. So I think there is a way of being open to your colleagues that maybe bring some other approach or background or skill that may not seem like the obvious one to add to a cool project. Yeah, I mean, I think one can just be open to people who don't fit that mythical image. Yeah.
Raise your hand, didn't you? You did, yes. Sorry, so I'm running all the way over here. So can the next person be more local?
Thank you. So you mentioned such tools as unionization and cooperatives as ways to kind of go against the system. And I was wondering how successful have these tools been while still operating within the capitalist system, and how many firms you've seen that have been successful in that way?
We're still trying to find an architecture firm that is unionized, and we don't know one. And so we're trying to do the background now for that, and part of that is getting all the architecture lobby members to identify the next step within their own firm, whether they're firm owners. But most of our lobsters are employees. So beginning to set up the network for each individual to learn how to speak to their colleagues. And so, yeah, the organization, there's a lot of organization training. How do you talk to a colleague? How do you set it up? I can't tell you about those successes. All I know is that more and more when we talk about this, not just amongst our members, but amongst other people, it's like, of course, unionization. Whereas I think once upon a time, you just mentioned unionization. It's kind of like never in architecture. You know, this is really, I've never said this out loud, but I kind of see this as like gay marriage. Once upon a time, it's kind of like gay marriage, you know, means men and women. It's, you know, that was even my reaction at first. And it's kind of like all of a sudden, you know, when you hear it enough, when you think about it, it's like, you know, that's a gut reaction. It's not a logical reaction. Then you begin to entertain it. And I feel that we're in that process. And it definitely helps that you read more and more in the media how different professional classes, creative classes are unionizing. And so, yeah, that's something that fell off the horizon and I think is back on the horizon, and I think the lobby is participating in that. Around cooperativization, there are many different ways to cooperativize, and we're trying to systematize those, and we're talking more and more to small firms that have begun in small ways to do it in order to broaden that horizon. The way most people are doing it now is sharing materials or sharing offices, but we're trying to set it up that you actually have what you call a producer or a consumer co-op. Those are two different things. As a consumer co-op, you can band together to get better insurance, better law agrees. You act together and you work at a larger scale. So those are things that we're setting up now, partly with firms that are already of the right mindset. But
Thank you, Jason. You brought up that a lot of the graduates, you want them to commit to working for firms that are following good practices, and you mentioned as good practices respecting overtime and watching the wages of workers and conditions of workers. What sorts of things can we be on the lookout for, like, in order to uphold that sort of commitment? Like, when we're looking for firms, is there a way that we can know that? Or is that one of those that we just have to do extra research? Because I know it's not always so black and white obvious.
yeah, ask for their office handbook. And if they don't have one, see what their reaction is. It's like, oh, we don't have one, because everything's above board. It's like, oh, really? Can you tell me how I might understand how promotion happens? Can you tell me whether you really are actively going out to hire women or ethnic or racial or economic diversity? I'd love to hear that. So if it's all just assumed, I'd love to hear more about that. But I think one of the things that is really interesting to talk about is agency. That was the last on that listing of transparency and agency, I think, are things we don't talk about. Ask them is like, has it occurred to you to let everybody in the office know what each other makes? And if you get a horrible look, it's kind of like, oh my God, that's going to say something. And they say, it's not practical, but it's something we might strive for. I mean, I think you can just ask probing questions and get a sense of what it's like. The agency, I think the agency is totally interesting. It just has to do with, do you participate in the 5-year plan? Do you even know what the 5-year plan? Do you know why they take the work that they're taking? Do you know why you're getting the work that you're getting as opposed to somebody else? Those are things that you should feel like you're participating in. And how do they react to that? Do they have meetings once a week where everyone sees what everybody else is doing? I mean, those are dumb things, but they kind of indicate an office that wants people to feel included and empowered and heard. I don't know. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, my dissertation was on the women leadership in sustainable architecture education. So I was kind of curious to ask you that, from my literature review, I found that, since we are 50% in school, architecture school right now, but it continued to reduce to about 1/3 on the registered architect, then continue to reduce to a little bit over 10% of women stay in leadership position in architecture industry or architecture area. So, and while I'm interviewing all those women leaders, and I was kind of shocked that the first thing they keep emphasizing is working super hard. And they all experience a bias from their practices. So I just wondering, are you aware any improvement they are doing on this, by AIA or any other organizations?
Yeah, you probably know Equity by Design, which came out of the San Francisco AIA group, Rosa Chang, and she's done a lot of work, and I think she's really pushed certain things, and I think that has led to a national statement, and I forget what the paper's called, but it is a plan for equity, which I think is really smart. So I think there's a slow growing awareness within the AIA about the issue. I think there could be much more overt exploration of the issue. I still think that in general it's a profession, and the AIA supports it, of people who do monumental work, who do glamorous work, and you give awards for that work, and one doesn't really look at the larger nature of the design environment, whether it's diversity or whether it's ethical labor practices. So a much larger change needs to happen. and one of the big changes that needs to happen is, the United States needs to just come up, and I was saying this before, with a mandatory paternity, maternity leave. Men have to take time off, so that there's absolutely no difference when you decide to have a family about whether you're the male partner or the female partner. None. Until we do that, it's just going to be a big problem. Which is one reason that we should all be political. We need to argue for those kinds of changes. But just to say, around the lobby and around the Me Too movement, it's absolutely the case that the lobby wouldn't be what it is without the work that feminists have done. I think feminists all along the way have been the ones, I would say, they're like the canaries in the mines. They feel it first and they feel it more fatally. And so the feminists have really demonstrated a certain activism that we build on. On the other hand, I also think that the Me Too movement and the problem with women in the profession is part of a larger labor problem. It's not like we just solved that little nut and everything's okay. It's a symptom of a larger problem.
Peggy, I feel like we're working you in an unfair way. The amount of labour that you're putting.
How much are you paying me?
Talk to our lawyers about that. Are you happy for a few more questions?
Yeah.
Is that
No,
okay?
I appreciate that people are interested. So, yeah.
So I was wondering, you said that we
Where
should.
Are you? Oh, there.
Right
Sorry.
here.
Yeah. Okay,
Sorry.
yeah.
That we should hold ourselves in like a higher position in the economy. And I'm wondering if you have recommendations for, other than like through unions or through cooperatives, how do we fight the stigma of we don't always need an architect? Like a developer can build a house, but like why do we always need our expertise, and how to fight that stigma?
Yeah. Well, again, I think that stigma comes from architect equaling aesthetics, and that's the problem. As long as we've defined ourselves as aestheticians, it's going to be impossible to fight that. But if we actually showed ourselves as, I don't want to say experts, but as people who have this longer term commitment to whether our projects bring a certain vitality to a neighborhood, whether they perform well ecologically, whether they perform well over the long term economically, maybe short term there's no benefit, but long term there is. The more people won't think that we're an extra, that that's the problem, So in some way, my argument that to demonstrate the long-term commitment is a way of escaping that. And again, my suggestion that we can deprofessionalize, I think is meant to do that. I think I said this before. Right now you say architect, it's like, oh, too expensive, won't listen to me, and it'll leak anyway. And so truly, why would somebody want to pay for that or do that? But I think once you begin to see that the expertise isn't that kind of exceptionalism where we are, you want that thing, but let me tell you what you want. As long as we're not that, but says like this is really how to make your project have a long-term value for you, for your neighborhood, for your family, and those things. People will want to come. So the idea is not to make them come against their will, but to make it really clear that we can do better than a draftsman. We can do better than a builder who has their son who went to drafting school and whatever. So, yeah. We're done.
I think we might be done.
Okay.
Peggy, thanks so much.
Okay, not at all. Thank you. Thank you all very much.